RC racing has been around for a long time, and has many stories worth telling. But to get to the heart of those stories, we have to go back to the beginning. Hello there. As you know, my name is rcracing, and today we'll be talking about probably the most popular and prolific RC brands in the world, Team Associated. Now, if you already know who I am, you may know I've done a video on my own channel about Team Associated long ago. Unfortunately, there are some incorrect points in that video, so here I am to rectify that. Very few RC brands can claim to have had such an impact on the RC world, and even fewer can claim to have over 30 if more titles under their belt. In this video, we'll be talking about their history, correctly this time, and where they might go in the future. We'll mostly be focusing on 10th scale and the RC10 and its history, but we'll also be talking about the very early days as well. With that out of the way, let's get started. Before land RCs became a mainstay in the hobby world, there were RC aircraft and slot cars. There were also two people named Roger Curtis and Lee Yaruda. Both of them worked in aircraft before deciding to get into the slot car business as a side hustle in Linwood, California in 1964. They made your average slot car accessories, including but not limited to wheels, bodies, braids, and tires. One day, Roger looked at the growing land RC part of the hobby, thought it looked pretty cool, and decided to build his own car with the help of one of his friends, Mike Morrissey. The RC1 8-scale gas-powered pan car was a huge success both on the track and financially as well, as when it was on the track, it completely dominated. Hell, it did so well that at the time, pretty much all of their competitors wanted to ban it. Now, where have I heard this before? Once the RC1 and later RC2 revision were cemented as a success, both Roger and Lee decided to get out of slot cars, which at the time started to wane in popularity, and dedicate themselves entirely to RC land vehicles. They also moved to Santa Ana, California. Unfortunately, there was some friction between Roger and Lee, so much so that Roger would begin to talk with an early RC racer and Roar winner named Gene Hussing in hopes that he would buy Lee's share of the company, and eventually he did. After this, in 1971, Roger and his team of 6 total people would go on to create the RC100, and once again it would dominate the 8th-scale pan car world. It would continue to do so until 1977, when the first IFMAR race ever was held at the time Thorpe Raceway, which would later become the Ranch Pit Stop, the birthplace of Losi. This is where Associated would set the tones for years to come, as the RC100 would go on to get a 5th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd, and 1st finish on the same race. This on-road dominance would continue for a while during the 70s, along with a new 12-scale pan car called the RC12, which in of itself would be credited with legitimizing RC racing as a sport, and in its Associated itself as a real threat. During this time, Mike Reedy would join the Associated team, handling the electronics needs, and they're using their cars, using Yokomo-based motors and very well-machined batteries to make Associated electric cars a real threat on the track. However, it was at this point where Associated would lay the groundwork for pretty much all future race vehicles. During the early 80s, lots of 10th scale off-road buggies were becoming more popular. So popular, in fact, that people began racing them. Now at the time, the only major player in 10th scale off-road buggies as a whole was Tamiya, and that was about it. Cars like the Grasshopper and Frog were popular picks for racing, but they weren't full-blown race vehicles made for getting around the track as quickly as possible. Roger and Gene went about to some of these races and were surprised by the lack of racing theory being used at RC racing as a whole. People were doing all sorts of weird things to quote-unquote improve their cars, from lead fishing weights, brass wheels, running a stupid amount of battery cells which led to more weight, until, in the words of Gene himself, they ended up trying to make the tank go fast. Gene and Roger knew they could do better, so off they went to create a new buggy inspired by full-size buggies, but not tied down in copying them either. Roger would design it on paper, Gene would handle all the boring business stuff of the company, while his son Curtis Hussing was the foreman of the machine shop they used, would build the car. In the end, Curtis would come back with 6 prototypes to use, but there was a problem. Team Associated didn't really have an off-road team yet. As a result, they went off to get some drivers for this new off-road team. You had Jay Halsey, a current off-road driver, Gil Losi Jr., yes, that Losi, who was at the time an on-road driver for Associated Electronics, Roger himself, the founder, Gene Hussing, and Ron Perry, a pro driver at the time. This team would go on to the 1984 Roar Nationals with the 6 prototype cars. To put it bluntly, they completely dominated with the car, now known as the RC10. This leads us to the 1985 IFMAR 10-Scale Worlds, where the RC10 would dominate once again in the equivalent of two-wheel drive at the time, then known as stock, with a 1-2-3 finish, with Jay Halsey being crowned the first 10-scale off-road champion. The RC10 would also take up all but 2 of the top 10 field in the two-wheel drive class. So what made the RC10 so special compared to other cars at the time? Well, quite simply, the RC10 was more suited to loose farm dirt tracks that were used at the time. It was very adjustable, and it had good geometry compared to other cars that came before it. For a long time during the 80s, if you wanted to win, you got an RC10. It was that simple at a regional level in the United States, at least. The RC10 and 10-scale off-road racing as a whole become extra successful, forcing other brands to either sink, swim, or run. Though one of those brands being Kyosho with their Ultima. In 1987, the next IFMAR 10-scale IFMAR Worlds would be taking place in Timsbury, Hampshire in the UK. AE walked in thinking they would sweep pretty much everywhere like they had been at any national level for a long time. The new Ultima, though, would go on to knock Associated off their podium completely and would send them home empty-handed. Even though the RC10 would still be extremely popular and successful, Associated wanted that IFMAR title back in 10-scale off-road especially. So when they came back 2 years later in the Upside Down land, otherwise known as Australia, with 2 things, the RC10 GX and Masami Hirosaka, who we now know as one of, if not the best RC driver of all time, it wasn't surprised that Team Associated would go on to win that year with a 1-2-3 podium finish, with a lot of the rivals not even coming close to terms of popularity or placement. This would go on for years, with IFMAR win after IFMAR win after IFMAR win. The RC10 would go through a few revisions itself as well, with the new B2 and later B3 being quite different compared to the gold pen chassis many were used to, using a composite or plastic chassis instead. This would continue up until 1997 at the Ranch Pit Stop. This would be the venue for the 10-scale IFMAR Worlds, and many things happen here. Not all great for Associated. We'll get to that at another more appropriate time. After 1997, Team Associated would hit back in 1999 with a 1-2 finish in Finland, once again with the B3. However, in 2001, Losi would strike back with a 1-2 finish in South Africa. Once again, Associated would go back to the drawing board to come up with a buggy that would be able to defeat the Losi XXX. This buggy would of course be called the B4. The B4 was basically a more modern B3 with a lower CG and other modern adjustable goodies. The B4 would go on to win multiple Roar Nationals and a few IFMAR titles as well in 2003, 2005, 2007, and 2011, along with countless regional and national events around the world in one way or another. The B4 platform was also around for a very long time, more than a decade, making it one of the longest standing platforms Associated has ever produced, with many different versions and revisions from expensive factory team versions to brushed RTRs. During the early 2010s, though, there would be a big change in the world of two-wheel drive buggies. Team Associated's main rival, TLR, had come up with a new buggy line called the 22. The 22 had an aluminum main chassis and made the car handle really, really good. Even though the 22 never won an IFMAR title until much later on, it was still becoming a more popular choice at the club level due to its handling characteristics and more modern and specialized design. As a response, Associated released the B5, which was a more rear motor composite chassis car, and the B5M, which was the more modern mid-motor design with an aluminum anodized chassis, much like the aforementioned TLR-22. The only difference this time was that the mid-motor B5M would go on to win the 2015 IFMAR Worlds at the Yatabe Arena in Japan with Spencer Rifkin as the driver. Funny enough, that was his first ever Worlds, period. This era of the RC10 may not have lasted that long, but it was a turning point in two-wheel drive buggies and 10-scale racing as a whole. cars were getting much more specialized for higher bike conditions. Not only that, but racers wanted to make more and more adjustments at the track without taking all late to get to the differentials, for example. Looking squarely at you, SC10 4x4. This need for a more tunable car while also being easier to work on will culminate in the next generation of RC10, the B6. Chances are, if you're watching this video, you have probably used or are currently using the B6 in one of its many configurations. This was also the first time the RC10 would come with a dual configuration. You could buy it as a dirt version that came with a stand-up transmission, or a carpet/clay version that came with a lay-back transmission. Now, there were other differences between the two, specifically arms and towers and such, but the transmissions were the main difference and selling points of the two cars. The B6 was more adjustable than the B5 and slightly easier to work on as well. After a little bit of time and many wins both at a local club level and a national level, the B6.1 would be released, which would more or less be the basis for the B6 platform that we all know and love. For one, there was the lay-down transmission, bringing the center of gravity as low as possible and the motor forward as well, and crucially, the easy access differential. Having a crucial tuning part of your car that once was something you had to plan out to remove, suddenly be something you could remove in about 10 minutes max is a huge deal. So much so that pretty much all two-wheel drive buggies and buggies as a whole would go on to create their own easy access differential systems. The B6.1 would go on to win the 2019 IFMAR Worlds at the Huddy Arena with, once again, Spencer Rifkin at the wheel as well. Also, when it comes to easy access differentials, the B6.1 wasn't the first, but it was one of the most popular. What made the B6 platform as a whole more of a success than anything else beyond all the national wins, IFMAR win, and countless regional wins was the fact that it sold in tremendous numbers. If you went to almost any modern track in the last 7 years in the US and many around the world, the majority of two-wheel drive buggies on the track would be some form of B6. You could find parts for it everywhere, it was easy to work on and build, and it drove pretty well on pretty much any track you threw it at, provided you tuned it properly. The B6 will go on to be the primary two-wheel drive buggies for most 10th-scale drivers from 2016 to 2044, which of course leads us to the latest iteration of the RC10, the B7. Now, since the B7 hasn't been out for too long, its story is still being written, and only time will tell if it's a step in the right direction. Like before though, it would have to contend with many different players looking to take on associated electronics in the world of RC racing, one of which wouldn't even exist had AE itself not gone back on a deal long ago. But that is a story for another day.
That's it for this video, but don't forget to subscribe and check out the rest of our RC Racing video series. And don't forget, be an RCTV hero. Make sure to hit that join button and find out all the details about being an RCTV hero.